because you want to learn a little... Hello. Refers to the amount that... Sorry, gotta wait for the heat to turn off. Nope.
Hello and welcome to my channel. Chances are you're here because you want to learn a little bit more about Aperture. Good news, you're in the right place. In this video, I'm going to explain what Aperture is, how to use it in conjunction with ISO and shutter speed, and share my tips and tricks on how to best use it to suit your artistic needs. So stick around. My name is Victor Malice, and I have been mastering photography for almost 3 years. In the professional sense, I am a portrait photographer. However, as an artist, I enjoy all types of photography, from light painting to wildlife, and everything in between. If you're new to photography, you're in the right place. And honestly, even if you're not, you may find something in this video that helps you fine-tune your craft. If you enjoy my content and find value in the videos, make sure to subscribe. With that, let's dive in. So what is Aperture? Inside your lens is a ring of blades called a diaphragm. The diaphragm is responsible for how much light gets through and hits your sensor. And it does this by dilating or opening and constricting or closing. The diaphragm can be electronically controlled by your camera, and some lenses even have a physical ring that you can twist to change the aperture like you would a zoom or a manual focus ring. So aperture, measured in what we call f numbers, refers to the amount that the diaphragm is open. Let's talk about this in relation to the human eye. The diaphragm would be your iris, which is responsible for constricting and dilating your pupil. Your pupil is the aperture, and your retina is the sensor. A practical example of your iris acting as the diaphragm would be when you go from a dark place to a bright place, or walk out your front door on a sunny day, and the iris will constrict. And so your pupil would get smaller to allow less of those intense light rays to hit your retina, which will ultimately allow your retina accurately capture your surroundings. On the flip side, if you walk from a brighter room to a darker room, your iris will dilate and expand to allow more light to hit your retina so you can see better. You guys want to hear a fun fact? Some historians believe that pirates wore eye patches, not because they only had vision in one eye, but because in the event of an attack, they would need to be able to move down to the hull of the ship and still be able to see. Now, the retina can take a few minutes to fully adapt to the surrounding light or lack of light. Therefore, the idea is that the eye patch was thought to be used to deprive one eye of light so that it remained poised and dilated, making seeing in the dark much easier at a moment's notice. This theory was tested and proven to be true in a popular TV series where they bust myths. Now, if you want to test for yourself, simply hold a hand over one of your eyes while in a bright environment for a minute or two, and then move to a dark environment and remove your hand. You'll see that the eye that you covered has adapted much more quickly than the eye you didn't cover. And when it comes to reading the current aperture on your camera, it will show up as an f number. The f number is calculated as focal length divided by the effective diameter of the aperture. So as an example, on a 35mm lens at f1.4, the effective diameter of the aperture is 25mm. Or let's say your aperture is 5.6, you would take the focal length, still 35, and divide it by 5.6, which would give you 6.25mm. The term smaller and larger apertures may be confusing at first, and that's because when it relates to the number value, like f1.4, f3.5, f12, the higher the number, the smaller the aperture. And the smaller the number, the larger the aperture. It's counterintuitive, so it'll probably take some time getting used to. Another aspect of aperture is depth of field. So what is depth of field? It refers to how much of your image is in focus. Now, I'm sure you've seen photos where the depth of field is razor thin, like this. So here you can see the depth of field is really shallow, and I was relatively close to the subject. And I'm sure you've also seen photos where the depth of field is so wide that everything in the photo is in focus, no matter how close or far it is from the camera, like this. Now in this photo, I have a really wide depth of field, meaning there are things in the foreground and the background that are both perfectly in focus. Now there are a couple different factors when it comes to changing the depth of field in your image. The most notable are the distance between your subject and your camera and the size of your aperture. The closer you are to your subject, the shallower the depth of field will be. The further you are from your subject, the wider the depth of field will be. Aperture plays a large part in depth of field because the light rays that get through your lens become either more or less focused depending on how wide your aperture is. The photo I showed you earlier was shot with an aperture of f1.4 and I was physically close to the subject. Now the other photo was shot at f14 and I was fairly far away from the scenery, so that's why everything was in focus. The last thing I want to cover with you is understanding how to use aperture alongside ISO and shutter speed. Now while all three of these settings can affect your image in different ways, with aperture creating blurry backgrounds or bokeh, and shutter speed helping you determine how much motion you want showing in your photo, and ISO primarily helping you expose your photo properly, aperture, just like the other two, plays a big part in your exposure. So it's important to pay attention to your exposure meter. You're gonna keep hearing me say this. It's important to pay attention to your exposure meter, but it's more important to trust your eyes. If you're newer in photography and you want to explore playing around with your aperture without having to worry about ISO and shutter speed, there's a function on your camera's dial that will show up as either A or AV, depending on the make and model, and it stands for aperture priority. Now with aperture priority, the only thing you control is the aperture. Your camera will automatically determine the right ISO and the right shutter speed, giving you the freedom to practice changing your aperture. So in short, aperture is responsible for two things: depth of field and the amount of light that hits your sensor. Make sure to go out and practice shooting in different apertures. It'll help you find and develop your own artistic style. There are many rules that are thrown around in photography. They're not written down anywhere. You'll just hear them from time to time from other photographers. Like for portrait photography, you need a healthy amount of subject-background separation. By no means does it mean that you can't shoot portrait photography at a higher f-stop to capture more of the image around the subject. Or that for landscape or architectural photography, you need to shoot at a higher aperture to make sure everything is in focus. Just remember, they are suggestions. So shoot the image the way that you want and start developing your style. And listen, sometimes your style is going to be based on a number of other photographers that you follow or that you appreciate their work, and you mash it all together, and guess what? That's perfectly fine. So there you have it. Aperture is just another tool in your bag to help you properly expose your image and perfect your composition. Head on over to my channel for more tips and tricks on photography. Until next time.